I would say that I got into studying autism a little bit by chance. I started graduate school, my graduate degree is in neuroscience.
Okay.
Before that I studied psychology. And I was always interested in the brain and brain imaging and some of those areas and methodologies. And I wound up in a lab that studied autism. It wasn't originally an interest to me, but then as I studied it more, it became more interesting to me. And brain development became particularly interesting to me, and how the brain changes over time, both in young children and as you get older.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of by chance, but one of those things of, as you learn more about a field, you get a better understanding of what the questions are and what's so interesting about it. And so it becomes more exciting as you get exposed to it.
Okay.
Socio-communication deficits, which is difficulties with, it can sometimes be difficulties with language, or it can be difficulties with other aspects of communication, so the social aspects, which may be someone who has perfectly good language skills, but they're not really good at the give and take of an interaction, and just don't get the cues from another person as well. And then the other areas is a bit different. It's what we call restricted and repetitive behaviors. So that can be repetitious motor behaviors. You may see rocking, you may see some hand flapping, but it may also be more of a cognitive, the restrictive interest part is a little bit overlapping with obsessive compulsive disorder. So it may be a fascination with one particular topic beyond what someone of that age would normally be involved in. You know, because like at a certain age, everyone's interested in dinosaurs, but when you become really interested beyond what everyone else does, or at an age where that's just not typical,
okay.
That's what we see. And those are the characteristic things. A lot of people also think of cognitive impairment as being one of the features, but it's not. You do often see cognitive impairment in people with autism, but they can have absolutely normal cognition beyond those features, and may have a Ph.D., you know, an advanced degree, may be very highly functioning. So although that's kind of the, you know, a stereotype almost, it's not actually an accurate one. So a misconception, yes.
Yeah.
It started quite a while ago, partly related to what was observed as a correlation between when young children tend to get vaccinations and when the symptoms are first noticed. That's partly because the symptoms that we base it on, you know, social interaction, communication, become most obvious when a child gets to be about 2 years old. You know, you can't notice that someone's falling behind until they would normally get that skill. So a lot of it is from that. There's a number of things that have led to it, but there's quite a lot of research actually that shows that getting vaccinations does not increase susceptibility. You can look across different countries, for instance. Countries that use vaccines don't use vaccines of a different type, you know, with or without mercury additives, all sorts of things, and the data doesn't back it up. We do know that if you don't get vaccinated, you're at higher risk of other things. Right now there's a big measles outbreak going on up in Washington. So there's, you know, we know those things. So the data is simply not supporting that risk, and there is quite a lot of effort that's gone into it in order to help reassure families that there isn't a risk for it.
Okay.
We don't completely know all the causes.
Mm-hmm.
There are genetic risk factors.
Okay.
So genetic studies have shown that there are some genes that increase the risk of autism, but we believe that it is that's a polygenic thing. So there are multiple genes that can contribute to it. You know, generally there's not one that's going to cause it. There are some gene anomalies that have very distinct syndromes that also have a very high risk of autism, and we can separate those out. But for the most part, what we call idiopathic autism is idiopathic. We don't know the cause exactly. We know risk factors, and one thing that we very much believe is that there's probably subtypes of autism. So in the groups of people that have the disorder, there's a lot of variability in how it's expressed. One of the common sayings in the autism community is, if you've met one kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism. He's not going to be like the next one.
Okay.
And we think that's partly because there are probably subtypes that are coming from different causes in one way or another, but still lead to this same syndrome. The Center for Autism, we're actually multiple sort of organizations here. The Center for Autism is new, and that's really our clinical branch
Okay.
of what's going on here. We are also the Brain Development Imaging Laboratories,
Okay.
which includes the center and includes a number of other things. The center is led by Dr. Ina Fishman, who helped to found it. She's a clinical neuropsychologist. I'm part of both. The aging study that we've got on autism is one of several studies that we've got going on at BDIL, the Brain Development Imaging Labs, in the center.
Okay.
So we've got, a study on toddlers. We've got studies on children and adolescents. We've got a new study starting on young adults, and then I've got the aging study. So our our aging and autism study is looking at people 40 to 65. Actually, we've just expanded up to 70 years old,
Okay.
who have autism, and then a comparison group as well. We are looking at lots of different aspects of aging and autism. Looking at aging and autism versus development in autism. The differences, none of the differences that are present in the brain in autism, they're not visible to the eye.
Okay.
We can look at a population that has autism, and we can figure out that on average there's a tendency to be different in one way or another. Maybe a brain structure is larger or smaller. Maybe the cortex is thicker or thinner. Maybe the functional connectivity, the quality of the communication between regions might be different. But you can't use brain imaging to distinguish the two groups. There's always a fair bit of overlap. But it still informs us on what's going on differently in the brain.
Okay.
And part of why it's interesting that we are looking both at development in some of our studies and aging in other parts is the curve of maturation. Early on, you've got lots of things that are maturing in development. The brain's getting bigger, it's changing the way that it's connected, and there's a lot of research on that in autism. And we know that there are differences in, for one thing, the speed and timing of development in autism. And so then that makes you wonder, though, are there also differences in, say, the timing of the aging effects, both maturation and decline that you typically see in aging? And so we're now looking at that to see, what's a little bit different. We've got a couple of studies that we've done so far. One that we just submitted is looking at functional connectivity, which means communication between different regions of the brain. And we're finding differences in sensory motor networks. On our tasks that we do, we find that there is lower ability in the older autism folks on some fine motor tasks, balance, coordination, and we also see reduced communication between some of those reasons, reduced functional connectivity between the relevant brain regions, suggesting that maybe there's either it may be a loss, or it could be that it was different to start with. And now we're looking at, you can still see it as you get older. One of the biggest challenges is finding participants at that age.
Okay.
For multiple different reasons. the disorder didn't get a name. It didn't get described in the literature until about 1945 or 42. And it didn't make it into our standard diagnostic books, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, until the 80s. What that means is there are a lot of people, older people, who have autism and never got the diagnosis because nobody knew what the diagnosis was. And because back then when they were kids, because it's a diagnosis you usually get as a child, back when they were 5 or 10 years old, nobody had heard of autism. If they had, they always thought of it as something with low cognitive function or with very poor language skills. And so people who are now in their 60s and 70s, if they have anything other than a fairly severe version of the disorder, may never have gotten a diagnosis. And because of that, it's hard to say, hey, we'd like people who are over 50 and have autism, because they don't know it. They're able to function in, very well in society, or they need just a little bit of help maybe. And that's the biggest problem that we have. And so for our study, what we do is we invite people who think they might have autism to join. They don't have to actually have a diagnosis. We bring them in. We actually start with a phone screening to find out, well, what are the characteristics that make you think that? And then if we think that there's a likelihood, we will then do a full diagnostic to figure that out. And we get a fair number of people that way who simply never had a diagnosis, or they had the wrong diagnosis. For the community generally, so we here at our lab have lab meetings on a regular basis where we talk about the science, and which is usually problem solving on a study. How do we analyze the data? It's those things that aren't usually very interesting to the community at large. For our outreach, we now actually have an outreach coordinator as part of the center, and so he did the main part of organizing our Building Bridges event. We also do, we've got a library series that we do, so at the public libraries. Some of our graduate students will go out on a regular basis and give some talks on different topics that may be of interest. So we do something on brain development. There's something on just aging generally, but they're general informational sorts of things. And so we post that on our Facebook and our website for when the next events are coming up. That was our kickoff event, the Building Bridges event. The center right now, a lot of it is just us here at the BDIL group. It is meant to continue to expand and bring in other departments, because the thing that I see as a potential benefit in the next few years is SDSU is really good about having, hopefully a gerontology master's program. It's got a Department of Education. It's got a Department of Public Health. It's got departments and programs that look at all sorts of real world issues in a way. So a lot of those areas where I think families want help of, I need to help my child with, his physical abilities. I need to help because I want to know are there things I can do about his nutrition? Mm-hmm. I need to know, what kind of speech language therapy is the most effective. And SDSU has those kinds of departments that are the real, the people that actually give day-to-day care to people with autism. So I feel like we're kind of placed here at SDSU to be able to try and answer some of those questions for them. We're not there yet. Okay. We want those Building Bridges events to help us figure out, okay, where is it you want us to go? Okay, now we'll start going there. And it takes a little while to get there, but I feel we have a lot of really practical skills that we focus on here. And so hopefully we will bring in more faculty members from lots of departments who want to look at autism, developmental disorders at all ages. and try and answer some of these questions that the families particularly want answers to. Yeah, it's the main thing is to see how aging might affect them differently. We know that their brains are different in subtle ways, but different to start with.
Mm-hmm.
That's what led to autism in the first place. Does that mean that they may be at greater risk for certain disorders later on? There's some suggestion there might be some new motor deficits that happen as they get older. So we want to look at that. We want to look at whether we can see that in the brain, whether we can see that in behavior, and whether or not, for instance, if there are motor deficits, are they at greater risk of falls? You know, things that are actually very important as you get older. Or potentially, are they more resilient to some things? Because when the brain is different to start with, the brain also tries to find ways around the problem, and it finds ways to compensate for the problems that it had to start with. The brain is incredibly resilient early on. It could be that some of those compensations actually make the brain a little bit better later on. But brain imaging lets us try to answer those questions. It lets us look at white matter communication between all the different areas of the brain, what parts of the brain are functional, whether or not you've got atrophy of the brain. It lets you look at higher cognitive functions. It lets you look at motor functions, at sensory perception, balance, vestibular system. So there's all sorts of things that are important that we can get at, and so we've got a whole lot of data, and it's just a matter of getting through all the data to analyze it all and give all the answers. We here at BDIL, we always have undergraduate students. We've usually got between 12 and 15 that are involved in research. They do everything from helping us score assessments and do data entry to attending or assisting at brain scans, just to be one more body there to help coordinate a family, for instance. They do quality assessment of our brain images. So they're involved in all aspects of both data collection and analysis.
Okay.
Yeah. And we do, I can never remember what RAP stands for, RAAP, and I don't know if that's specifically Department of Psychology or if it's across the university, but that's one way that they can get in touch to find out what we do. But they can also, we've got, our website does have information or a link about how to get involved, because we often get students who are just sending us an email and saying, I'd like to do something, what can I be involved in? And we very much rely on the help of undergraduates to get the data, to get all the data and all the analysis done, So there's always opportunities here. Retired on a beach. No.
Retired.
So we are about 3/4 of the way through the adult study for the first round of it, because the funding that we get is usually in packages of about 5 years. So I'm hoping to get a lot more of this data analyzed, see what's going on. Hopefully sometime this year we put in the proposal for the next 5-year set where we get to follow up on what we find and start addressing more specific questions. I hope that for the adult study or for the center more broadly, we can start getting into intervention type things. I think what I'm most interested in, coming from the adult literature, is some of the motor functions. So just sort of seeing, are there ways to improve some issues? I mean, there's some other studies in the country that are looking at like yoga, for instance, improving balance through doing activities like that, or meditation even for cognitive skills and for overreactivity to things. So I'm interested in maybe starting to move that way. That's still a few years down the line, but that's what I'd like to see, is some things that are easily adaptable, that we start looking into, what can help with daily life. The first question is figuring out what you like doing. And that's one of the hardest parts. You want to wind up doing things that you get satisfaction from. You either enjoy doing the work or you enjoy the sense of satisfaction of having done the work.
Mm-hmm.
Getting it, and that can be a hard decision to make. I encourage students to try things. When I was an undergraduate, I didn't know, do I want to do clinical psychology? Do I want to do neurobiology? What do I want to do? So I went and I found some opportunities to do each one, found ones that didn't appeal to me at all and ones that did, and was able to get that, help with that decision that way. That then also leads you into getting more experiences that help you go on to the next step. So either through volunteering or through internships or doing like an independent study to get experience at the kinds of things that you are hoping to do eventually, that helps you to, if you want to go to graduate school or to an advanced certification program, it helps you not only decide that you like it,
Mm-hmm.
but actually get in, because you've shown that you've got the motivation and the interest and the skills, you've developed the skill set, and that helps you get on to the next step.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in.